Well, a very good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where in the world you're tuning in from. My name is Adrian Reed, and a very, very warm welcome to this BA community webinar. I'm very pleased to be joined by my sort of colleague and friend, Alec Sharp. Thanks for joining us today, Alec. I know you've got a very busy agenda, so thrilled you could fit us in.
Well, busy these days in the garden.
Yeah.
There's more gardening time and less flip chart time in my life lately. But
Yeah.
yes, things haven't slowed down all that much.
Yeah. That's great. That's great. And we're going to be talking about business analysis trends, what's new, what's different, what's changing. But before we get started, I'm pretty sure that Alec needs no introduction to those of you that are on the line, but just in case some of you haven't come across his work, I was reading this, Alec, and I need to check the text is correct because it says Alec Sharp has managed his consulting and education business, Claritech Systems Consulting Limited, for close to 40 years. Like, was that from elementary school? I mean, like...
No. And here's one of the great developments in my recent life is that a couple of years ago, I officially became a senior citizen in Canada.
Oh, wow.
Which entitles me to cheap hamburgers on Tuesdays and an incredibly inexpensive season's pass for skiing, which of course disappeared in the COVID thing. But yes, I've had my own consulting business since 1981.
Fantastic.
Oh my God.
Fantastic. Well, time flies. And of course, Alec, you're known for, data modeling, process modeling, keynote speaker around the world. I see you at conferences, you run sellout workshops, you're keynoting, you've written a best-selling book that's used by MBA students as well on workflow modeling, I think. So, a really, really interesting and varied career. And of course,
best-selling, but not in the Jeffrey Archer sense.
Well,
in my little niche, it did well.
I think, I think not in a Jeffrey Archer sense is probably a good thing. But okay, so thinking about trends, I thought somewhere we could start, Alec, is possibly around data modeling, which I know is a bit of a specific thing to start on. And I should say, by the way, for those of you that are on the line, please do ask your questions as we go along. You can type your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll cover as many as we possibly can as we go along. So starting with data modeling, because I know that's something you and I have quite strong views on. But one thing I notice is it's sort of gone out of fashion in some organizations, or rather, it doesn't seem that many BAs are necessarily doing it. Why do you think that is?
Well, I've been doing data modeling, or now we often prefer to call it concept modeling or domain modeling, just because, as you suggest, data modeling got a bad rap.
Yeah.
And basically what happened, I fault the tools. I remember the first time I sat down many years ago at a data modeling tool, and a guy was Steve LeGraley, a fellow I learned a great deal from, was showing me this tool, and we started to build a data model, and I created an entity, and the first thing the tool asked me was, what is the primary key? Which is the absolute last thing you should be worrying about. And I realized pretty quickly that these so-called data modeling tools were not about data modeling. They weren't about business-friendly concept modeling. They were thinly disguised database design tools.
Yes.
And that got a whole generation or two generations of people thinking, oh, data modeling is all about technology. But when Peter Chen came up with entity relationship modeling, it was a very business-facing technique. It's all about communication, common understanding of language, terms, constraints, and so on.
Yeah, and that's really interesting, Alec, because I mean, one thing that I've found, I'm sure many people listening to this webinar will have found, is actually people can say the same word but mean different things. And
what is a customer?
Yeah, I mean, this is exactly, and I mean, I can still remember a piece of work I did, and this was a good few years ago now, where
but not 40 years ago.
But not 40 years ago. No, not quite. But essentially, I was doing some requirements, and people have been using the term joint policyholder for an investment product. It's kind of like an offshore life insurance wrapped product or bond or whatever. And everyone had assumed that joint policyholder meant like two, like husband, wife type of thing. And it was only I was sketching, because I, like you, probably sketch these things when I'm like, and it prompted me to ask the question. And I remember the person saying, oh no, it could be like 40, because there are these big institutional policies that are written in trust where all the trustees are, and you're like, oh, okay, that's a very different thing. So I find, and it's interesting that you say concept model there, because I find often it helps me ask better questions.
Oh, absolutely. A lot of people who are tuning into our webinar will know that I believe the most important question for data modelers or business analysts in general is, you have to stroke your chin and say, what do you mean by, what do you mean by a case? What do you mean by a prospect? And you have to be unafraid to ask the dumb question. I remember once at Intel, I was doing a consulting job at Intel, the world's largest chip maker. And I said, well, wait a minute, before we go any further, can somebody tell me what is a chip? And there was, eye rolling from these quality and reliability engineers, like, oh my God, what a silly question. And I said, no, please help me out. Like I'm an 8-year-old. Explain it to me. Well, we had 7 different definitions came out of what is a chip. Everything from a die, a single square of silicon with logic circuitry burned into it, all the way up to a product family.
Yeah.
And people were like face palming. It's, oh, no wonder we don't communicate so well.
Yeah.
So you have to be unafraid.
Yeah, absolutely. Be unafraid. And I love that, like that 8-year-old childlike curiosity. And because it hits to the nub, because otherwise you get that situation where people appear to agree, but they're actually agreeing to different things because their mental model's in a completely different place. So then,
absolutely. I always say everybody's looking at the world through a knothole in a fence.
Yeah.
And they're not all seeing the same thing. But
so,
here,
sorry, Alec, go ahead.
I just wanted to say though, data modeling fell out of fashion, but now it is the explosively growing in my business. The last few years, I've seen this really fascinating phenomenon where people who would have said 5 years ago, data modeling's for dinosaurs. In fact, they actually said that to me. I was like, what are you calling a dinosaur? But the data scientists, the analytics people, the IoT people, the data lake people, the NoSQL people, everybody was saying, data modeling's for dinosaurs. And now that's who is flocking to my data modeling workshops. I had this great example where I was teaching at a large institution in the Netherlands, or a public offering through my colleagues at Adept Events, and one person from this financial institution was there. And at one point in the class, he sort of face-palmed and he said, oh my God, I can see now that we've been building a data swamp, not a data lake, because we're not agreeing on terminology and concepts. And then their entire data lake team came through my workshops, and then they decided everybody needs this. So roughly 100 business analysts are going through in-house offerings of my business-oriented data modeling class. And I see that happening all over. So it's really coming back with a vengeance.
Yeah, so a trend we should all be aware of. And actually we have our first question in, and I think this is it's a related question and a really great one from Fabricio, and I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, Fabricio.
Hey, Fabricio. Yes, he said that this webinar was going to be unmissable. Great to know you're out there.
And he asks, where did all the models go in the projects that followed an agile approach? So concept models, processes, decision strategy, they've disappeared. All I see are user stories. Oh, I feel your pain.
Yes, yes. Well, I'm going to touch on that a little bit later on when we talk about frameworks, but I would say that 50% of the people showing up in my workshops are agile practitioners who have, like, here's one of the big trends is, boy, this is a big one, but agile is now the default. It's the norm. We've crossed the curve. We're into the late adopter territory. I sometimes feel the term agile doesn't really have any meaning anymore because that's the default approach. But what we're seeing because of that is agile isn't being deployed just on small scale initiatives. It's being used on enterprise scale undertakings. And, a bunch of user stories on Post-its is just inadequate. If you're looking at improving your global supply chain, you need more than that. So you need an end-to-end process view for context, and you need the underlying concept model so you're all talking the same language. So I'm seeing a real shift. Agile's the mainstream, but now the people I work with, the first 1 or 2 sprints are devoted to modeling.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, I echo that sort of view, Alec. And one thing, and in fact, I've been having this conversation a lot recently, and I don't know if it's just coincidence, but I've been talking to folks I work with about requirements architecture.
Right.
And what I mean by that is, yes, it's quite sensible to have user stories that are consumed and used as a unit of work. I know they're not a unit of work, but I can't think of a better term than that. They go through
I will strongly argue that it is a unit of work that can be rigorously defined. So I'll come back to that.
Yeah, yeah. But however, it's like a user story is useful, but it's not enough type of thing. So actually, it may have some acceptance criteria, but you might have a user journey, and you might have a central data model or data dictionary. And I find when you've got things like that, everything else is easier because you don't have to keep defining what you mean by customer, and you don't have to write every single given when then acceptance criteria if you've got a prototype. I mean, you'll need some, but so I sometimes see that the user stories need to call out. But the thing I've found, I don't know if you've found this, Alec, is if that conversation isn't had early about requirements architecture, then what you get is lots of disparate artifacts that don't connect together.
Absolutely.
And then you get caught in this trap where you end up just having to almost repeat yourself on this. I mean, it's maybe not a physical story card, but a Jira ticket or whatever. And you're like, but we've got all this other good stuff we've done.
I know, and you keep circling back. A lot of, I guess on that topic, one of the things I'm grateful for is that I've stayed very active as a consultant. So I'm not just speaking or teaching. I do a lot of hands-on work. And the biggest change I've seen in my career hasn't been the techniques or the methods. In fact, techniques from many years ago are coming back into vogue. The biggest change I've seen is the time constraint. People they have the attention span of a gnat, and they expect more in less time. So I've honed my techniques over the years, and I do a lot of consulting jobs where we go in 2 or 3 days and do significant process redesign. And the reason we can do that is because we don't just dive into the weeds. We build an overall framework, a process scope model. We build a common vocabulary with a concept model. And that enables you then to deliver results in agile timeframes. Otherwise, you're chasing your tail.
Yeah, and it's kind of that upfront investment. I just want to bring in something that Nick says here. So thanks.
Is that our friend Nick DeVoyle?
It's not Nick DeVoyle.
Okay.
It is another Nick, but it's a Nick I know well.
Okay.
And Nick says, first 2 or 3 sprints are devoted to modeling. I wish our organization has recently adopted SAFe and our safe coach is actively discouraging us from modeling up front and to let it all emerge. I'm having to hide my concept and data modeling under the covers, which means it doesn't get tracked as a story with points. I mean, that sounds like, I mean, it's great that Nick is doing that by stealth. And I think often as BAs, we end up doing stuff by stealth, but that's a tricky situation to be in, isn't it, Alec?
Well, I think I wrote a blog for Irwin, for Computer Associates, Irwin tool. And my first blog post was about guerrilla versus gorilla modeling. Guerrilla, as in you're doing it behind the scenes under the covers, versus gorilla, where you're beating people over the head. But I think just as a survival mechanism, well, let me back up. This advice from your safe coach is horrible advice. You know, you wouldn't go to a construction site and have a bunch of lumber drop there and hope that a house would emerge. You know, I mean, it's a preposterous concept. And this happens when, I'm sorry, but this just makes me angry. But on the other hand, it keeps me in business. So that a big part of my consulting business is what I call project recovery. Yeah. And that's where organizations spend tens or hundreds of millions of dollars, and sometimes even, in the most extreme case I can think of, $3 billion with nothing to show for it. And that's because they thought it was just going to emerge, or they thought that a requirements document with 8,000 bullet listed requirements was going to suffice.
Yeah,
I mean,
Nick's just added.
Just don't get me started.
Nick's just added. It makes him angry too, which is so. We should probably move on from that. So can
I just got to say one thing though. I'm really, I get really distressed when people start to treat methodologies as religion.
Yeah.
And that certainly happened in the Lean community and in the Six Sigma community. It becomes dogma, and it saves people from thinking.
It does, and we should probably move on and talk about contexts in a second, because that
Sure.
relates to context. But I just want to. There's a few specific questions, Alec, and it might be that some of these are not something you can cover off here, but I'll see what you think. So Bermot asks, what do you think about SAP Power Designer as a tool for data modeling, if any opinion at all? I don't know if that's something you can or are able to.
Well, first of all, hi, Bermot. I put the book in the mail about 3 weeks ago. I hope it arrives soon. And for Power Designer questions, we should probably refer to our friend George McGeechee. So I'm really not up to speed on the tooling, but from what I've gathered from people who know, like George, that's a powerful and effective tool. Fantastic. Now, I happen to believe that the most useful modeling I do, Post-its and flip charts. Or, nowadays, Jamboard or Miro or...
Yeah. Well, and this is it. And I think there's that question of fidelity, isn't there? And you can explore and ask those childlike questions. And I say childlike, not childish. It's that curiosity. But you can ask them off the basis of a very low fidelity picture. And then formalize it if you need to.
Absolutely, because there's a progression. I think one of the reasons people got turned off of modeling, like for instance the Safe Coach, is because people have confused modeling with actually like technical design. I've met many people over my consulting career, when I ask, can I see the data model, they bring out the physical database design. Well, before you get to the physical design, you have a logical model and a technology-free representation. And before that, you have a conceptual model, which is the business-friendly basis for communication. And before that, you have a contextual model, which is all about clarifying scope. And if you jump too quickly into the weeds, well, that's just one of the most common problems I see, a rapid descent into technical detail.
Yeah. And I think particularly as BAs, we ought to stay at the top of that stack.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, so just before we move on, I want to bring in a couple of questions. So, in Indira, I think it's Indira or Indy, in the business process lifecycle, some people are now saying data-driven approaches are the best way to ensure business process transformation, which I agree with as an aged data modeler of yore. I'm sure that's not true. Do you also agree? And do you have any suggestions onto how to get businesses to understand data modeling is a good place to start?
Well, that was, I love you, Indira. That's a brilliant question. And I will, first of all, I will sort of boastfully point out, I got the DAMA Professional Achievement, the Data Management Association Professional Achievement Award 10 years or so ago, specifically because of techniques that I had developed to engage business people in doing data modeling without them knowing it. So people who've taken, for instance, my business process class know that the starting point is a data model. You just don't tell people that's what you're doing. We focus on terminology. So, what are the terms? Well, we have a case. Is a case the same as a proceeding? Is that the same as a hearing? So we establish terminology. And then, for instance, once we have a term, people who've suffered through my courses will know I believe that everything boils down to verbs and nouns. So the nouns are typically the objects or entities in your data model. The verbs are what happens to them. So you take a noun like a case and say, okay, what happens to a case? Oh, well, we initiate a case, we schedule a case, we adjourn a case, and people are very, they have it's very easy for them to start identifying events. And from there, well, how do these events tie together? And then pretty soon a process is emergent. Mm-hmm. But it's a very data-driven approach.
Definitely.
In fact, the one slide share that I'm going to do will come back to that point.
Yeah.
Great question.
Fantastic. And Indy's confirmed that it is Indy. I thought it was Indy. I thought, but so it was Indy rather than Indira there. So.
And where's Indy calling in from?
I can't see that actually from the chat. I think the UK, because I'm pretty sure I know who it is, but there we go. So okay, anyway, we should move on to one of the many other topics that we'd sort of semi-planned to discuss, yes. which was.
It's time for me to bring out a different dopper because I've gone through a lot of water. Absolutely. Thank you, Bram. This is a limited edition dopper from the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam.
Indy's actually in Toronto. Oh, of course you are, Indy. Yes, Toronto. So she's other side of the coast from you.
I should wave the flag.
So I want to talk a little bit about shifting business context, Alec, because it is often said that the pace of change is getting faster. That's probably an understatement at the moment. There are new disruptive business models, and now we're all working from home. Or most of us are working from home. Yep. So how does that, if we're thinking about business analysis trends, how does that affect us as BAs, this velocity of change that's like nothing we've seen before?
Yeah. Well, I think that this comes back to what I said before. You're not going to sustain velocity by treating this as a random walk. So ironically, look, I do, as I said, I do a lot of project recovery work, and that is often because an organization has skipped any sort of upfront what is the topic that we're looking at, and they've descended much too rapidly into unhelpful detail. And 100% of the time, when I'm brought in to help out in these situations, I have to bring people back to the big picture and build a scope model. So I have a very simple framework for establishing, say, the scope of a process or a family of processes. I did a webinar with Lucidchart recently. Maybe we can include the link to that in the follow-up material. And I talked about the value of these scope models and also the underlying concept model. So ironically, this is the strange dichotomy. We're in this faster and faster world, but I'm seeing a return on a large scale to more formal techniques, which we had been told. There was a lot of publicity, like, oh, analysis paralysis and so on. But once you get to a significantly sizable or complex business area, a random walk isn't going to do it.
Mm.
And so I'm finding that in the current business context, a lot of my consulting work is helping people put some order on chaos sometimes of their own making.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I answered the question, but it felt good.
Yeah. Well, I think it did, because I think, as you were talking there, I was thinking about I was thinking back to user stories. And, if you think about, well, what's one of the types of projects that probably many of us are working on? It is digital transformation.
Yeah.
Whatever digital transformation means, it seems to mean very different things in very different organizations. But, you can't actually transform, or I don't believe you can transform by just going and saying, well, let's brainstorm the top 20 features and then slice. There needs to be some that's a bit like saying, well, I need to go from the UK to Australia, so let's brainstorm the features of the vessel that will get me there. You're going to end up with, well, it must have wings and a rudder, and do you know what, actually probably some wheels. There's no inherent coherence between
it. It's not going to just emerge.
Yeah, and actually this is a good point to bring in an observation that Rick makes. He puts, hypothesis: good architecture is not purely emergent. It's a combination of intentional and emergent. And he adds for
write that down. Capture that. That is brilliant.
I'll save that one for you, Alec.
Okay.
And he says, for the person with the dangerously misinformed safe coach, have them reference Architectural Runway from Leffingwell. And he's put a URL in here, which unfortunately Zoom won't let me copy and paste in the chat. But if you can probably Google it, but if anyone can't find it, I can send it afterwards. So
yeah, maybe we'll make some things available after this.
Yeah, that would be great. Fantastic. Okay, and then that also.
I just love that idea of the intentional and the emergent.
Yeah, I mean,
it's why, like, my methods are meet in the middle. There's some top down, but there's also, I do a lot of primarily bottom up work.
Yeah. And actually, on this note of coherence, Stefan raises another really interesting question. This is back to that sort of safe question, and very, very glad you could join us, Stefan. Stefan is normally in Belgium, but he might be in the Netherlands. I'm not sure where, because he got locked in. I'm not sure whether he could get across the border before lock-in and stuff happened. But Stefan says, even in safe, you have to start first with epics, but how do you decide on epics? So what comes before? So, actually there's got to be something to decide what the epics are. And he asks, of course, agile or safe isn't enough. There's a track that comes before. So business context, business processes, ... So he's referring to that kind of pre-project holistic type analysis.
Yes, absolutely. I remember sitting in what is possibly definitely one of our favorite conferences, the IRM UK Business Analysis Conference. And I was sitting in the big ballroom, like right up front as usual. And somebody was talking about epics and figuring them out. And the young woman next to me got so agitated, she smacked her hand on the table and said, haven't these people ever heard of a business process? Because, and it's the same with, I get upset about the people building capability models and so on who've reinvented 25 years of business process work. So there is definitely, before we get into our epics and user stories and so on, there is some context establishing the activities. I have a framework that I've built over the last 25 years for doing business analysis. And at the top, the top of the 5 layers is, mission, strategy, goals, and objectives. Where are you trying to go as a business? That is then realized through your end-to-end business processes. At certain points in a process, somebody needs to interact with an application or a system, and we can describe that interaction with a use case. And then I do something quite unusual. I separate the use case into the outward-facing view, the interaction, and what's happening in the background, which is the service, the service component, whatever you want to call it. And under all of that is your underlying data model.
Yeah.
And this, you can go through this in any direction, but back to the earlier question about data-driven approaches, I often start with the data model without telling people that's what it is. So we identify entities, then we say, what are the events that happen to those things, and describe how those are handled. That's our services. Then we say, who needs access to those services? That becomes our use cases or user stories. And then where do those fit within an end-to-end business process?
Yeah.
And so you get a mix, as we heard earlier, of intentional and emergent.
Yeah, yeah. But the nice thing about that is you've got the inherent connections between it. You've got a whole rather than a series of disparate parts.
And that's what I've spent most of my career trying to figure out, how these different techniques work together. Because as my friend Myler Page Jones in Seattle once said to me, he said, if you read one book on use cases, you'll be fine. If you read 2, you're lost.
That's
because
true.
They're all very different. And if we extrapolate that, the people who wrote the data modeling books don't talk to the service-oriented architecture people, don't talk to the use case and user story people, don't talk to the business process people. These are all very disparate, unintegrated views.
I'll bring in a question from Rick here. And Rick asks, can you highlight why it's critically important that we focus first on the process model, so the dynamic model, rather than the data model, the static model? Although we often use the existing data model to drive the discovery of the end-to-end processes, which I think is what you've just described there. You've said data model, then process.
Yeah, I typically, I don't tell people we're building a data model, but that really my starting point is usually terminology, and that, what are the things? What are we going to call these things? How do they fit together? So even though, I don't call it a data-driven approach, it very much is. So typically, I try and start with the things, because the things, the entities, if you want, are what the processes act on. I'll just talk it through this. So we start with the business objectives, which typically we might write up in a project charter or project initiation document. Then what we want to know is, what do we do in support of those business objectives, which we can represent in different kinds of process models. And then one of my main tips for when you are doing any sort of process model, stop at the point where you have described what must be done. Do not get into describing how. The most common problem I see is people document procedural level information in a process model.
People kind of document obtain signature rather than authorize payment or whatever.
Absolutely. And a clue is when you see the same actor performing 8 or 10 steps all in a row in a swim lane diagram. You are documenting a procedure. So we should use other forms to document the how. And that could be a checklist, it could be a procedure, it could be a decision tree, or if how somebody, say, registers a student in a class, we can document that with a use case. So I end up with, in the details, my use cases end up in this when-then format, which describes the interaction between an actor, typically a carbon-based life form, and a system. And this is the unusual part of my approach, but I've been doing this for like 25 years. I separate what's happening behind the user interface and describe that in a service. So this, actually, I've been doing this a long time, but the method has become very popular in organizations that are trying to adopt a service-oriented architecture. Or this year, it's microservices, which turn out to be indistinguishable from services, but that's another point. So I document the rules and logic, and the cool thing about this is you can describe a service once, like register a student, and then expose it in multiple use cases. You have something for a professional in the registrar's office versus self-serve by a student. And then underneath it, we have the concept model, which is the things that we need to know about in order to operate the business. And so everything relies on the concept model. So we have a thing, like a class, and then what happens to that thing when we register a student in a class, that becomes the basis for our service. Then exactly who needs to do that, then you have actor plus service and platform. That becomes your use case or user story. And finally, you can link those together into different points in a business process. So the data model, everything, the data model establishes the language that we use all through the rest of our requirements analysis. And that's why I always start there.
Fantastic.
Even if I don't call it that.
Yeah, yeah. Fantastic. Well, thank you. I mean, that in itself is like a gold mine of expertise there, Alec. And I mean, out of interest, are you aware of any? I mean, a question that I'm sure people will have on their mind is what sort of tools? Because people tend to think about tools as well as approaches. So, are you aware of tools that support this type of approach?
Well, actually, that's an interesting question, and there's different kinds of tools. So obviously, you can have diagramming tools like Visio that draw the pictures but don't really maintain a repository. Then my colleagues at Lucidchart are sort of moving, up the food chain, and they're actually developing facilities so the tool knows that it's dealing with data or process. And then at the high end, then we have some very robust tools. I used to do a lot of work with a tool called Provision. Originally came out of the Proforma Corporation, and then Meta, and then I think the document manager. I should know, the Canadian document management company owned them now, and it actually was originally based on exactly this model. When I first saw the tool, I thought they had ripped me off.
Right. Wow.
But Jerry Huxenmeyer, the guy who created the first version of the tool, had come up with exactly the same framework, slightly different terminology, but process, use case, he called it a transaction, and then underneath that, a data model.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll go through as many questions as we can, because the questions have been pouring in since we've been screen sharing, which is always a good sign.
Fantastic.
So first off, Venkatesh asks, Alec, would you touch on the Zachman framework? I mean, that's a really big question, but any brief thoughts on how the Zachman framework relates to what we've been talking about?
Yes, yeah. So first of all, John Zachman is my hero. That I remember the first time I saw him present way back in the late 1980s, after he first published a framework for information systems architecture. I was like, I want to be that guy when I grow up, because he just made it all so interesting. And there's my framework is a little different. Here's where there's a lot of similarity with the Zachman framework. The point here is there are 3 commonly recognized levels of detail, and each of the kind of models that I talked about can be described at these different levels. This is an ugly slide, but it's also the most popular slide I ever built, because it shows that there is a small number of models, process, use case, service, and concept model, that can be deployed in a wide variety of situations. And each of them can be described at these progressive levels of detail. Different detail, but also for different audiences. And this is, So my columns here, scope, concept, and detail, are precisely the same as the rows in the Zachman framework. The planner's view, which is scope, the owner's view, which is concept, and the designer's view, which is detail or logical. But my sort of breakdown into business processes, like a business process spans things that are multiple columns in the Zachman framework. But philosophically, there's a lot of consistency.
Fantastic. Excellent. Thank you. So we'll whiz through as many of the remaining questions as we can. And apologies if we can't get to your question. We'll get through as many as we can. So I'll combine two questions here. So we've got Edward. And Edward is from Richmond, BC.
Hi, Edward. I'll be talking to Edward on, he's with the IIBA in Vancouver. So we'll have a chat on Friday.
And I'll combine Edward's with another question. So Edward asks, have you any advice for someone starting a career in business analysis? And I'll combine that with Mike's question, who says the role of a business analyst appears to be becoming fragmented over an increasing number of more narrowly defined and more specialist roles. So how do we as business analysis professionals maintain the holistic view? So there's two questions there. One about getting into the role, one about maintaining a holistic view once we're in there, when the profession there's a perception it's fragmenting.
Boy, does anybody have an easier question out there, Adrian? Well, my advice many years ago was to, spend less time. I'll get in trouble for this. Spend less time worrying about certifications and specific techniques, and more time reading business publications. I've learned more useful lessons from reading Harvard Business Review and Sloan Management Review than I've learned over the years from any more IT-focused publication. I have to be careful about what I said about certification, because I'm not a fan of certification, but in many cases, if you don't have it, your resume, your CV doesn't even get looked at. So it's become a filter of sorts.
It definitely has. And I think to springboard from that, Alec, I'd say in terms of getting into the role, is one thing I always suggest is that virtually everyone I've ever met who thinks they're not a BA but wants to get into the role is. They might not have the title, but I remember speaking to someone once who they worked, this is going to sound crazy, they worked in a ticket office, like a rail ticket office. And they said, well, I've got no experience as a business analyst, but I really want to be one. And I chatted to them on the phone, and they described to me process improvement that they'd done. And I'm like, that is a process improvement. You might not think that's business analysis, but it is. So actually, I always say, look at what you've done, play that up, but look at the gaps, because okay, maybe you've done lots of process work, but you've never worked, you've never specified requirements, and then see how you can work that into your role, and then springboard from that. So
I think the two, even though we see all this focus on use cases, user stories, user journey, and so on, I think understanding the concept of the end-to-end process and understanding the concept, the underlying concept model, are fundamental. And years ago, back in the 1980s, being the geek that I am, I joined up with 4 other colleagues, and we formed we called it the DA, as in the Data Administration Discussion Group. Once a month, we got together over drinks and appetizers. And one of the things we would do is just try and build a data model for something we knew nothing about. So I used to open remember the yellow pages?
Yep.
So I would just open the yellow pages and, dry cleaners. And then I would say, okay, well, what would the data model for a dry cleaner look like? Or a car rental.
Just to interrupt you there, because one of the questions I have, and I'm sure I'm going to pronounce this person's name wrong because it's not a name I've seen before, so apologies. I think it might be Zanti from South Africa. Says, could you quickly step us through a basic concept data model or contextual data model. So, I mean, pick an industry and just talk us through how that might work, Alec. Imagine we've got the yellow pages.
Yeah, well, okay. There's an example that I start with in my workshop, and this was a safety management organization that wanted the organizations to be more self-policing. So we ended up with the idea that we have a client, an organization, let's say, British Petroleum. The British Petroleum operates multiple facilities, a particular refinery or oil well out in the Canadian wilderness. And at those facilities are located units, pieces of equipment that have to conform to certain regulations. And those units over time are subject to inspection. And initially people said, well, the facility is the location of one or more units. The unit is located at a facility. And then when we pushed on that, well, no, it turned out units can move. So we started discovering that there is a many-to-many relationship between unit and facility over time, and that turned out to be very important. We learned more about how units are inspected. We learned more about the authorization that was granted to operate your own program, and that was a big discussion. Is the authorization granted to the company? Mm-hmm. Is it granted for a certain set of units, or is it facility by facility?
Yeah.
So a simple 5-entity concept model resolved all kinds of questions. And the important thing is it surfaced questions that never would have occurred to the business to ask in the first place.
You see, this is reminding me that idea of authorization about a project I did, which involved it involved issuing of approvals for things in a regulatory sense, and we got into some interesting discussions about licensees and applicants, when an applicant could be applying on behalf of a different licensee, but a licensee could have different sub license. So you get, and again, concept models can clarify those sorts of conversations.
Yeah, parties and counterparties, and
yeah.
It's as long as you treat it as all about communication, not about relational database design.
Yeah.
Anyway, that was a great question. Thank you.
Fantastic. So I am going to motor through as many of the remaining questions as I can. So first, a comment from Jason, who says that he agrees with Alec and Adrian that establishing a ubiquitous language early doors is key. Absolutely, completely agree. We have, I don't know whether you know Hertje from Holland, but a friend and colleague of mine. And Hertje says, I find that sometimes stakeholders feel more at ease with starting with the things, and others are more focused on the functionality. And she finds that some BAs can be the same, and we meet somewhere in the middle where the processes touch the data and vice versa. Do you agree?
Beautifully put. Yes, I do. And even though I am, my preferred mode is to start with language, which is the concept model or the data model, I can't always do that. So I try to start where my clients are most comfortable. And by the way, that's why most of my methods are quite bottom up. Mm. So if the client wants to talk about activities, functionality, fine, we'll do that. We'll identify the key activities. Oh, and here's a pro tip. If you want to stay out of the weeds, don't let your users, your stakeholders, bring in the who and the how. Okay, yeah. Here's my mantra. I had this ready to go. Okay, don't start with the why. What first? What are the things? What are the activities? Then we add the who and the how, and then we've got enough context to say why are we doing this in the first place. But if you focus on the what with verbs and nouns, people can't get into the weeds. And then you link that together into processes, and then you pull the nouns out and you build your data model.
Fantastic. Fantastic. We've got lots and lots of people saying hi to you, Alec. I can't read all of the names out, but you're clearly a celebrity.
Oh,
So
gosh.
I'll move on to the next question, which is...
And I just wanted to a shout out to Venkatesh, who, if that's my old friend from Bangalore. Hi.
I'm sure. So Joe says, hi, so many suggestions already. Currently working on a removal of a legacy system project and moving the functionality into a portal. And she mentions a CRM, a well-known CRM and finance system. We're well into development. Well, the tech team are, not her, and seem to be in a constant. Well, the business need to tell us what they want, and the business saying, "Well, we don't know what we want until you show us what the system can do." So this is a commercial off-the-shelf type package. In trying to nail down the requirements, so we're getting there, but it's quite painful and time-consuming. Any tips?
We'll put the link. When I'm in a situation like that, first of all, I've done a lot of reverse engineering over the years. So what are the things, how does your existing legacy application see the world? What are the things it recognizes? And then simply play that back to the business and ask if that's an adequate view of the world. That's actually going to be part of my talk at the Business Analysis Conference in London in September. I'm also big on pulling back to a scope model. Okay, so CRM. So maybe one thing you're doing is onboarding a customer. Okay, what are the 5 milestones that you go through when you onboard a customer? Then within each milestone or phase, what are the major activities or events? Okay, and then now you've got a framework, and now we get into, so that was intentional. I'm going to come back to that idea. You were intentional in building the big picture of the processes. And then once you identify the events or activities, then you get into emergent mode, and people can start to explain the pain points or how the tool doesn't work.
And I mean, a very, very brief point to springboard from that, Alec. But one thing that I think is sometimes a bit of a lost gem is talking about events and event analysis, because actually, if you think about a context model and well, actually, if you know what the events are, it kind of doesn't matter what you put into that space. It's got to respond to those events.
Yeah, absolutely. So a model that I cover I'll give a quick example. So in that regulatory environment, one of the important things was a unit, a piece of equipment. And then it was really easy around that to say, okay, well, what happens to a unit during its life? Well, we register it, we operate it, we idle it, we inspect it. And our business clients have no difficulty identifying these events. Mm-hmm. Well, that's an entity in your data model. Register a unit is an event or a service. And then we say, who needs to be able to do that? Whoops. And so, as an example, whoops, I've lost my headset. I know we're running out of time. So our customer service representative might register a unit on behalf of the client, or the client does it self-service.
Yep.
And those are 2 different use cases or user stories.
Fantastic.
And I do this all the time. And it's interesting. It's a formal technique.
Yeah.
Data model, event analysis, use cases, user stories.
Absolutely.
But it means you can get through a domain an order of magnitude faster than you would otherwise.
Fantastic. And we will have to pause there. I'm just going to ask you one question, because it's one which is probably a yes or no question. And the question is, do you do much work with small businesses, say less than 15 employees? Or I guess a different way of asking this is, do you see a role for these techniques outside of large corporations?
Yes, absolutely. Some of my happiest consulting engagements have been with startups. I've worked in companies as small as 10 or 15 people. I find a very interesting threshold is 40 people. Once an organization gets to roughly 40, they get beyond the 2 pizza for a meeting size, then they start to realize, wow, we better formalize. How do we onboard an employee? How do we launch a product, and so on? So absolutely, these are still relevant.
Fantastic. Well, Alec, I mean, we could go on chatting for hours, but we have reached our allocated time, unfortunately. So
allocated, is that a pun or?
No,
allocated?
Not intentionally, but I'll claim it anyway.
Okay.
So, I am absolutely certain, Alec, that people will want to stay in touch with you. There are questions that unfortunately we haven't been able to cover. Are you happy for people to connect with you, to ask the questions they haven't had the chance to get answered on this session today? And if so, how can people follow you? How can they find out about your courses?
Well, I think some people will want to see those slides that I shared. So we'll arrange for that and some additional information. Anybody who wants to send me an email or send it to you, and then we can collaborate, I'd be thrilled to be able to answer more questions.
Well, I'll include a link to your LinkedIn profile on the wrap-up email as well, so people can stay in touch and see where you're presenting and come and see you.
Okay. And we'll both be at the Business Analysis Conference in London.
We will.
Yep.
Absolutely.
And I'll also include a link. I did a webinar about 35, 40 minutes for Lucidchart a while ago, and we're launching a series of webisodes. So I'm going to 7 to 10 minute tutorials on certain aspects of working with business processes. I'm very excited about it.
Fantastic. I love that idea of webisodes. So excellent. Well, Alec, thank you so much for taking time out of your morning. I think it is in your time.
It's still morning. Yep.
Yeah. So, I mean, a really, really interesting session. Thank you so much for taking the time out. And a massive thank you to everyone who has tuned in live for all of your questions. Apologies we couldn't cover them all, but that is the sign of a topic that has really resonated with people. As a reminder, the whole ethos of these webinars, the sort of philosophy behind it, is to perhaps have conversations about things that we don't often talk about in the BA community. So to talk about things on the periphery or the edge of business analysis. And at the moment, so normally they run once a month. At the moment, I'm running them once a week because we've got lockdown and all sorts of other things happening, so people are a little bit more available. When you exit the webinar, you'll see a whole bunch of other ones. Please do go ahead and register. There are about 3 or 4 available right away. You'll also, when the email goes out, you'll get a survey, a very short survey. It's about 3 questions. Would be very grateful if you could fill it in. One of the questions is, what topics would you like to see in a future webinar? And put a topic in there, because if it's one I can find a speaker on, I'll try and arrange it. Equally, if you're sitting there thinking, well, I'd really like to present on, well, put your name down on the survey and I'll contact you and we can make that happen. So, good evening, good morning, depending on where you are in the world. Have a fantastic rest of the day. Thanks again, Alec, and hope to see you all soon.
Yeah, thanks everybody for tuning in. It was great to hear from so many friends. Easily the best part of my work is all the great people I get to work with.
Excellent. Well, enjoy the rest of your day, everyone, and see you again soon.